early winter rain in Seattle seeped into every seam of her clothing, settling like a heavy, damp shroud over everything, refusing to evaporate, refusing to ease, clinging instead to her skin and her thoughts. It was 10 at night, yet inside the obsidian, the light still glowed dim and amber, a beacon in the gray downpour. The air was thick with people, with the scent of seared steak, truffle oil, aged red wine, and expensive perfume that couldn't quite mask the metallic tang of the city rain. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if it couldn't quite shake off the mixture of forced elegance and deep, spiritual exhaustion. Sweat slid silently beneath the tight black shirt, clinging to the body of the server, blending with the faint scent of rain she wore and the hidden fatigue she carried. Celine Hart had been on her feet for 11 straight hours, her steps repeating like a program written into her bones as she navigated the crowded dining room where people laughed, ordered, toasted, and pretended to care about one another. She moved with the rhythm of someone who had trained herself to read a customer's needs before they knew how to voice them. Her lower back throbbed, her calves burned, and the practice smile she had worn for nearly 3 years in this job was beginning to crack at the corners. But she could not slow down. Not tonight. Not when her tips would decide whether she could pay her heating bill or spend one more week dreading the shivering cold of her drafty apartment and the unanswered phone calls from creditors. The main dining room of the Obsidian buzzed with the same Friday night energy as always. Men loosened their ties after business deals that might not be as clean as they appeared. Couples gazed at each other across candlelight, trying to reclaim feelings time had already carried away. Tourists took pictures of their meals as if they were landmarks. Celine slipped through all of it. A silver tray balanced effortlessly on one hand, her steps steady, her words exact, her expression friendly enough, but never too familiar. She had learned how to be invisible, as any good server must, present in the moment a need appeared, but gone fast enough to protect a customer's privacy. Perhaps that was why she noticed him immediately. Table 9, tucked in the far corner behind a velvet rope, and a frosted glass divider that shielded it from the main dining room, the table reserved for those willing to pay extra for absolute discretion. Xavier Draven. She had served him 3 times in the past 2 months, always the same. Arriving at 9 wound sharp, always alone, except for the bodyguard seated at the next table, ordering a rare steak he barely touched and a bottle of Crimson Reserve, a vintage not on the public menu, leaving a tip of exactly 20%, never raising his voice, never summoning a server with a snap of his fingers, never causing a scene. Yet every employee understood that Xavier Draven's table required the precision of a surgical procedure. Because on the rare occasions when someone brought the wrong glass or interrupted him during a moment of quiet thought, they were not fired, but they simply vanished from the schedule, their sections reassigned as if some invisible hand rearranged their reality without a word of explanation. Celine had learned not to ask questions about men like Xavier Draven. In a city like Seattle, where the tech giants and old money families were tied to things no one wanted to name aloud, survival meant lowering your eyes and keeping your observations locked inside. She knew he was important in the kind of way that never appeared on a Forbes list. She knew the slight, predatory grace of his movements hinted at something older than his apparent 30 years. A place where secrets never die. They only sleep in coffins. She knew the custom suit he wore cost more than her combined earnings for a year. And tonight, she knew something was different. The first time Celine ever served Xavier Draven had been a night in the middle of November when the rain turned to sleet, and the bare branches cast long, skeletal shadows across the wet pavement outside the obsidian. He stepped in at 9:05, just as he had tonight, neither loud nor drawing attention. Yet his presence alone seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The heavy oak door closed behind him, shutting out the storm, and every gaze in the VIP section paused for just a single beat. Xavier was not handsome in the usual human way. His face carried a classic sharpness, angular, with deep obsidian eyes, not cold, but void-like, piercing enough to make a person feel seen, in ways that stripped away their soul's defenses. He was tall, lean but powerful, moving with the precision of a predator who calculated each step before taking it, wasting no motion. No one introduced him to Selene. No one needed to. Men like Xavier did not require names to be recognized. He sat at table 9, unfolded the black silk napkin across his lap, and did not look at the menu. Selene approached with a water tray, following protocol, though her heartbeat had been noticeably quicker that night. "Good evening. Would you prefer still or sparkling water?" The familiar question left her lips in the same calm tone she always used, though she felt the faint tightening in her shoulders. Xavier lifted his head, and for a brief moment, his eyes met hers. Still. No ice. His voice was low, velvet-wrapped steel, carrying a resonance that vibrated in her chest, softened in a way that made her lean in slightly without meaning to. She turned to pour the water, noting the order he conveyed without ever speaking it. Rare steak, bloody, no garlic, no silver cutlery, a bottle of the private reserve. It all took less than a minute. No wasted words, no unusual requests. But Selene felt she had just stepped into a space without signposts. In the visits that followed, Xavier arrived at the same time, ordered the same meal, and always had the same man seated a table away. Cade. A large, quiet figure dressed plainly enough to disappear into the background. Cade was someone Selene had never seen look away from the room for more than 3 seconds. Xavier never once asked for Selene by name, but on his second visit, when she approached his table, he said, "You were the server that night." Not a question, a statement. She nodded, instinctively smoothing her hair, and immediately resented herself for doing so. "Good. You work very professionally." That was all. No smile, no polite flourish. Yet his words lingered with her the entire night. A small flame in the damp cold. After each of Xavier's visits, Selene tried to treat him like every other customer, but she knew she was watching him more closely than she should. She noticed the way he cut his steak, as though each motion carried the weight of centuries. The way he tilted his wine glass so the light skimmed the surface, thick and rich, before he tasted it. The way his eyes swept the room before returning to center, mapping exits, heartbeats, and jugulars with quiet efficiency. Xavier spoke very little, but every word had purpose. And Selene sensed something she could not allow herself to articulate. This man did not come here only for dinner. Something existed beneath the cashmere, beneath the polished Italian shoes, a layer of silence thick as a tomb, hiding something far larger than fine meals or expensive wine. Xavier was the kind of man who made others believe he needed no protection. And yet, he had Cade. And for Selene, that was the first piece of the puzzle that made her pay more attention than she should. He was not warm, not approachable. But in a world as noisy and artificial as the obsidian on any given night, his silence held a power she could not ignore. And then, as always, he finished his meal, left the exact tip, stood, and vanished into the Seattle mist, as if he had never been there. Yet his presence never truly left the room. And deep in her instincts, Selene knew one day she would have to choose between being silent like him or breaking that silence. The fourth time Xavier Draven appeared at the obsidian, the rain was so sharp that a thick gray film of water clung to the restaurant's glass doors like a sheet of weeping sorrow. Outside was wind and storm. Inside was the warm glow of amber light and the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. Celine knew he would come as always at exactly 9 Nal, and at exactly that moment, Xavier walked in, his charcoal gray overcoat draped over him, leather gloves on his hands, moving straight toward table 9, as if the entire room were no more than a backdrop. Cade followed like a shadow, carrying the same calm, quiet demeanor. But tonight, only 5 minutes in, Celine realized something was wrong. Not with Xavier, but with Cade. The man she once believed could stand still as a gargoyle for an entire evening kept sliding his hand into the inside pocket of his coat and pulling it out without retrieving anything. By the third time, she could no longer pretend it was a thoughtless habit. She passed their table the first time to refill water, the second time to check the candle, the third time to deliver the entree. Each pass was justifiable, brief enough to remain unnoticed, yet long enough for her to watch. Cade was no longer holding the posture of a guardian. His shoulders drew inward, his leg bounced with an uneven rhythm, a nervous tick unnatural for his kind. When Xavier said something, Cade merely nodded without meeting his eyes, his jaw clenching, the muscles shifting as if he were grinding his teeth. The longer she watched, the more certain she felt that this was not simply a bad night for the bodyguard. She had been in the service industry too long not to recognize when someone was hiding something. There were gestures only those who lived behind the curtain of hospitality could read. The way Cade checked his watch no fewer than 3 times within less than 10 minutes, each glance lingering longer than necessary, as if counting down. Xavier was unchanged, cutting his steak with those smooth, precise movements, eating at the same measured pace, not hurried, not relaxed. He revealed no sign that he noticed anything unusual happening within arm's reach. But Celine noticed, and the feeling clung to her like wet leaves on the pavement, cold and unmoving. She wondered whether she should say something to the manager, but then remembered the quiet reshuffling of staff schedules every time someone made even the smallest mistake with Table 9. No one ever said anything aloud, but everyone understood. This was not a man to be disturbed. And Celine, though every instinct screamed a warning, chose silence and kept watching until she saw Cade take a secret call. He did not lift the phone to his ear, only glanced down at the screen beneath the table before snapping it shut. She could see his thumb moving quickly over the screen as if typing. Not an innocent message. Not from this man. An hour later, when Xavier requested another glass of wine, Celine approached with her usual composure, but her mind spun with scattered details. The bodyguard shifted his chair to get a clear view of the back door, kept checking his watch, avoided eye contact, typed hurriedly on his phone, and something about Xavier's complete unawareness made her even more uneasy. If a man like him did not notice, then either he was choosing not to, or he was being kept in the dark. Both possibilities were dangerous, and Celine, who had no significance in this world, found herself fearing for a man who had never spoken her name, yet lingered in her thoughts in ways she could not explain. She stood behind the service counter, her hand resting on the water pitcher, while her eyes stayed fixed on the shadowed corner where Table 9 sat. The scattered details were no longer scattered. They began linking themselves into something that tightened her stomach. Cade was no longer the immovable wall she once believed him to be. He was doing something else, something that did not belong to a loyal protector. She saw him glance at his watch again, quick and sharp, as if counting each minute. Then a stranger appeared. Coming from the direction of the restrooms, an area that connected to the murky back hallway, a middle-aged man emerged so ordinary that no one would have a reason to look twice. His hair was short, thinning a bit, and he wore a damp wool coat far too heavy for the temperature inside the restaurant. He smelled faintly of earth and dried lavender, a scent used to mask decay. He did not look around, did not acknowledge the menu or the candlelight. He simply walked toward the table where Cade sat, saying nothing. Selene was carrying dessert to table 4 when she saw it. The stranger's hand slipped into his coat pocket and pulled out a pale yellow envelope, thin and precisely folded. No logo, no writing. But here, in this moment, it could not be ordinary. Cade was not surprised. He leaned slightly forward, accepting the envelope in one fluid motion, no hesitation. The gesture was too practiced to be accidental. The envelope disappeared into the inside pocket of his vest beneath his coat, so fast that if Selene had not looked at exactly the right second, she would have missed it. The stranger did not linger, did not speak, only turned and walked toward the bar where the dim light swallowed his face into shadow. Selene stood frozen for a few seconds, her breath heavy. She tried telling herself it might be personal papers or confidential work documents, anything harmless. But something in the smoothness of that exchange made it impossible to believe her own reassurance. In a city like Seattle, where everything could be a mask, the smallest details were often the loudest confessions, and Cade had just received something not meant for daylight. When she returned to Xavier's section, his second glass of Crimson Reserve was already more than halfway gone. He still sat upright, his expression calm as he focused on the flavor of the rare steak. But Selene no longer looked at him the way she once did. She looked at him the way someone might look at a beautiful painting hanging on a wall that could fall at any moment if the nail gave out. She could not be certain her interpretation was correct, but she had lived long enough to know there were signs a person simply could not ignore. Like the way Cade now kept his hand close to his inner pocket, no longer resting both hands on the table the way he used to. Like the way his eyes drifted toward the entrance, then to the back door where staff moved in and out, as if every doorway was either an exit or a threat. Selene had never imagined she would find herself in a moment like this. She was just a server trying to collect enough tip money to pay bills and save for a steadier life. She did not belong to a world where envelopes changed hands in the shadows or glances carried layers of meaning. But tonight, somehow she had stepped into that world. And if she was right, if that envelope was the beginning of something worse, then the man sitting only a few steps away might be the one being placed on the board as a sacrifice. The problem was, he had no idea. And she, whether she wanted it or not, now held a piece of the truth no one else had seen, and it was burning through her from the inside. Selene stood behind the service counter, her hand trembling slightly as she opened the drawer to take out more dessert menus, but her mind was spiraling into a vortex with no way out. The envelope, the way Cade accepted it, without even looking. The quick flick of his eyes toward the back door as if he were timing something, waiting for an event to unfold according to schedule. And Xavier, still calmly cutting the last piece of steak on his plate, seemingly unaware that a betrayal was taking place right beside him. Selene tried to take a deep breath, but the air inside the restaurant suddenly felt thick, as if every voice, every clink of dishes, even the soft strands of jazz were being crushed into a single oppressive weight. She had learned to ignore things that did not concern her, had chosen silence as a means of survival, in a world where silence was sometimes the only thing that kept a person safe. But tonight, something inside her urged her to break that rule. Her heart pounded so violently it felt ready to burst, and her instincts screamed that if she did nothing, something would happen, something terrible, something that could not be undone. She pulled the small order notebook from her apron pocket and took the pen clipped to the counter's edge. The first slip of paper was torn hastily, filled with shaky, incoherent sentences that read like the rambling of someone losing control. She crumpled it and shoved it aside, grabbing another. The second attempt was shorter, but too vague. "Be careful. Something is wrong." Reading it back, she knew Xavier would never react to a warning so frail. He was the kind of man who responded to evidence or to a fist hitting the table, not to a whisper. She tore off another piece. This time, she set the pen down and wrote with all the clarity she could muster. "Your bodyguard received an envelope from a stranger. You are the target tonight. Do not use the back door." Sharp, clear, no rambling. She read it twice, found no mistakes, no wasted words. Her hand still trembled, but the letters were bold and unmistakable. She folded the paper into quarters and slipped it into the leather check holder. The room around her continued moving, as if nothing had changed. Couples laughed and raised their glasses. A group at table 8 snapped photos of their food. But to Celine, every sound felt warped. Every movement slowed. She walked toward table 9, each heartbeat heavy as a hammer. Xavier looked up when she approached, his expression composed. "I can bring your check if you're ready," she said, her voice steady and professional. So controlled it startled even her. Xavier nodded. "All right." She set the check holder down beside his water glass, just as she always did. But inside, it held more than a bill. It held a note that might change the course of an entire night. As she turned away, she caught Cade's gaze for half a second. She offered a polite smile, but her palms were slick with sweat. She walked back to the counter, refusing to look over her shoulder. She had no way of knowing what Xavier would do. She did not know whether he would believe her. But she did know one thing. If she stayed silent and something terrible happened, she would never forgive herself. Behind her, the soft sound of paper unfolding broke through the air like a quiet exhale, and the entire world seemed to hold still with Celine, waiting for what would come next. Celine stood behind the counter, pretending to polish a wine glass, though her eyes never left table 9. Xavier rose to his feet, not hurried, not abrupt, not in any way that would attract attention. He simply stood as though he had finished his meal and was ready to leave. Celine held her breath. If he went out the front door, everything remained within a safer margin, though it would draw attention. But if he moved toward the back, the direction Cade kept glancing at, Xavier stepped forward 2 paces, then suddenly turned left toward the double doors leading into the kitchen. Celine's heart stopped. "No!" she wanted to shout, but her throat closed. The passage through the kitchen led directly to the alley behind the restaurant, the very place she believed a trap waited. She had written clearly not to use the back door. Why would he walk straight into it? But as Xavier's hand pushed open the swinging door, Celine realized something. He was not heading toward the emergency exit that led to the alley. He veered sharply toward the old wine cellar staircase, a hidden route used only by senior staff to transport vintage barrels from the underground storage, a route that led to the city's old maintenance tunnels. Xavier was not walking into the trap. He was slipping beneath it. Cade's head jerked upward. In that instant, his cold eyes tracked Xavier's movement. And for the first time that night, Celine saw raw panic flash across his face. He knew the cellar. He knew that if Xavier made it to the underground network, the entire ambush planned for the alley, filled with UV lamps and silver nitrate, would collapse. Cade leapt to his feet, the chair scraping loudly enough that several customers turned their heads. His calm facade shattered. "Sir," he called out, his voice cracking with strain, "that is not the exit." But Xavier did not look back. His shadow disappeared through the kitchen doors, decisive and cool. The doors swung and closed behind him with a soft, deadly finality. Cade did not waste a second. He launched forward like a beast released from its cage, his right hand plunging beneath his vest, ignoring the startled glances around him. He knew he had lost the element of surprise. Celine froze behind the counter, gripping the dish towel so tightly her fingers blanched. She saw Cade's eyes flick toward the service station for the briefest moment before he stormed into the kitchen, a look filled with suspicion and violence. She had interfered with their game. And now the king had slipped out of checkmate. Cade moved from the table like an animal sensing danger in the air. No more ease, no more composed posture. He crossed the room in quick strides, his right hand sliding into his coat, where Celine was certain he hid something that had no place in a restaurant. No one in the dining room sensed anything unusual. A few guests glanced over due to the loud scrape of the chair, then returned to their wine and conversations. But Celine saw everything. She saw Cade's walk shift into a restrained run, his attempt to appear calm failing as he closed the distance to the door Xavier had passed through. Instinctively, she turned her head toward the swinging doors. They were still moving slightly, not fully closed. But Xavier was gone. She did not know what he was doing. Whether someone was waiting for him inside, or whether he had a plan to counter this betrayal. All she knew was that Cade had read something in Xavier's movement, and he was unraveling. Cade slipped through the doors and vanished into the staff area. Celine saw him pull out his phone, his fingers racing across the screen, as if triggering a chain of actions prepared long before tonight. The air in the dining room shifted again, not because anyone spoke, but because at the edge of her vision, near the right corner of the restaurant, another man was moving. The stranger who had passed the envelope. He had been lurking near the bar. Now he moved toward the hallway leading to the back door, the same direction as Cade, at the same moment. But seeing Cade's frantic sprint, the man hesitated. Realizing the trap had failed, he blended back into the shadows and fled toward the main exit. Celine began to shake. She felt it now. She had stumbled into something far bigger than she could have imagined. This was no longer just a bodyguard's betrayal or a warning scribbled on a slip of paper. This was a plan coordinated with multiple players, and Xavier, unless prepared, would have been walking straight into their trap. She wanted to call someone, but whom? The police? They would take at least 10 minutes to arrive, if they believed her at all. The management? They did not even know who Xavier truly was. She could chase after them, but to do what? Stop Cade? She had no weapon, no plan. And most importantly, she did not know if she would survive if she pushed deeper into this. But she could not stand still. Not after writing that message. Not after Xavier had trusted her enough to act on it. She left the counter and walked quickly toward the kitchen, stopping 3 steps from the double doors. Through the narrow gap between them, she saw nothing. No strange noises, no shouting, no panic, only silence, thick as night. And then, from somewhere inside, she heard the soft metallic clatter of something hitting the floor, small but sharp enough to stop her heart. Celine pressed her back against the wall, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron, her mind spinning. She did not know what was happening beyond those doors, but she knew one thing. The plan had fallen apart, and now everything was about to change. She strained her ears for even the smallest sound. There were no gunshots, no shouting, only a strange, prolonged silence that made her skin prickle. After a moment, the door swung open. But it wasn't Xavier who stepped out. It was Rick, one of the assistant cooks. His face looked a shade too pale, his eyes flicking behind him before landing on Celine as though he couldn't fully register her presence. He walked quickly, saying nothing, greeting no one, disappearing within seconds down the corridor toward the staff storage area. Celine understood then that something had happened inside the kitchen, and Rick wanted no part of it. She turned, moving quickly toward the locker room, every step pressing into the cold ground beneath her shoes. Her shift had ended more than 20 minutes ago, yet no one stopped her or asked questions. The entire restaurant seemed paralyzed by a tension only the perceptive could feel. She removed her apron, unpinned her name tag, folded her shoulder towel, and placed everything neatly into her locker. Her hands were still trembling, her heart not yet returning to a normal rhythm. She put on her wool coat, wrapped her scarf tightly, and slipped out the back door. Rain drifted down in icy sheets. The parking lot behind the restaurant was nearly empty. Only a few lonely cars scattered across the dark pavement. Celine crossed the brick courtyard, her boots leaving faint imprints on the wet concrete. She had not brought her car. Her apartment was about 6 blocks away, and she often walked home to save every last dollar she could. But tonight, every step felt heavier. The wind slipped beneath her collar and through the layers of her scarf, carrying a damp chill that felt like someone brushing their fingers across her skin. She quickened her pace, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed ahead, though she could not stop herself from glancing over her shoulder now and then. At first, there was nothing, but by the time she turned onto the 3rd block, the sensation had settled in her bones. Someone was following her. Not clear footsteps, not a voice, not even a definite movement. Just the unmistakable feeling of eyes pressed against the back of her neck, tracking her, memorizing every motion. She paused, pretending to adjust her scarf. She cast a discreet glance behind her, but the street was empty, except for a weak street lamp and a parked car. She resumed walking, this time faster. The unease didn't fade. It sharpened, as though every footstep she made left a mark someone else was tracing. When she turned into the narrow alley behind her apartment building, her heart pounded. The light here had been out for a week, and tonight the darkness felt like a curtain heavy enough to swallow anything whole. She hurried, her shoes scraping along the concrete, stopping only when she reached the iron door leading to the shared hallway. As she slid the key into the lock, she heard it. A faint sound behind her, like a shoe sliding lightly over wet leaves. Without thinking, she spun around. The alley was still pitch dark. No one stood there, but the lid of a large trash bin near the corner trembled slightly, as if something had brushed against it. Celine didn't wait to find out what. She unlocked the door, darted inside, slammed it shut, and slid the bolt across. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath short and frantic as though she had sprinted. She stayed pressed against the cold metal door for several long seconds, listening. No footsteps, no knock. But the feeling stayed unbroken, so vivid it couldn't possibly be imagined. Someone had followed her, and that someone knew exactly who she was. It took nearly 15 minutes before Celine had calmed enough to move away from the entrance. She turned on every light in her small apartment, closed the curtains tightly, and checked the door locks 3 times before allowing herself a full breath. She removed her coat and her scarf, but kept her shoes on. Her feet were freezing, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the phone on the table. No missed calls, no messages, nothing from Xavier, nothing from the restaurant. The silence was unnerving, a silence that pressed against her skull. She boiled water, poured herself a cup of tea, her hands still unsteady around the mug. The faint scent of mint rose into the air, but did nothing to soothe the turmoil spinning through her mind. Who had followed her? Was it Cade, the stranger? Or someone else? Someone she hadn't even noticed yet? The questions knotted in her chest with no answers. Then her phone rang. The piercing sound cut through the quiet, jolting her so hard she nearly dropped the mug. She grabbed the phone. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. No name. Her hand hesitated for a beat before she accepted the call and lifted it to her ear. Celine Hart. The voice was a woman's, low, steady, neither rushed nor warm. "Who is this?" Celine asked, trying for calm, but unable to hide the edge in her voice. "My name is Renata. I work with Xavier Draven." The words struck her like a blow. She tightened her grip on the phone. "Is he all right?" A long silence, almost the length of a heartbeat, passed before Renata answered. "For now." The way she said it made "for now" sound more terrifying than any threat. "So, why are you calling me?" Celine asked, her voice dropping lower. "Xavier read your note, and because of it, he avoided a trap." Renata spoke with deliberate clarity, each word carefully measured. "We know you're not with them, but you've stepped into this now, and you need to make a choice." Celine's pulse hammered. A choice about what? Renata didn't answer right away. Another slow, heavy silence filled the line before she continued. "I want to meet you. Not over the phone, not in public. We need to be certain you're not being followed, not compromised. And more importantly, we need to talk about why Cade betrayed him." Celine stood frozen in the middle of her living room. She wasn't an agent. She wasn't police. She was a server, a woman who happened to notice something wrong and was brave, or foolish, enough to act. Yet here she was, standing at the threshold of two worlds. One was the simple, fragile life she had been scraping together. The other was the world of people like Xavier, people who lived in the shadows, where every decision carried consequences. I don't know if I can help any further," Celine said softly, though something deep inside her already knew she had crossed that line. "I'll send the address," Renata replied quickly. "Tomorrow night, 8:00. Come alone. Tell no one." The call ended before Celine could say another word. The screen dimmed. Her apartment fell silent again. Inside her, fear tangled with curiosity. Reason tangled with something deeper, a thin, invisible thread pulling her forward. She knew she was no longer a spectator in this story, and tomorrow night, everything would change. The following evening, exactly at 8:00, Celine arrived at The Written Word, a dusty antique bookstore in Pioneer Square. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and leather, with the scratchy hum of jazz drifting through the warm amber light. Xavier sat at a back table, his presence commanding even in stillness. When he looked up, the hostility was gone, replaced by a quiet gravity and something resembling gratitude. "Thank you for the warning," he said, his voice low and steady. When Celine admitted her uncertainty, Xavier countered simply, "But I am alive, which means you were right." Pressed for details, Celine described what she had seen: Cade's erratic behavior, the constant checking of his watch, and the stranger who passed him the envelope, a man smelling of wet earth and lavender, like a grave. Xavier revealed the depth of the betrayal. Cade had served him for 80 years, yet he had sold Xavier out to a rival faction to escape his eternal bond. "You do not need to look over your shoulder for him," Xavier said darkly. "Cade has been removed from the equation. Permanently." He then placed a small black velvet box on the table, offering an ultimatum. "You can walk away tonight, safe but invisible. Or you can step further in, learn to survive in my world, and be protected permanently. But in exchange, there is no path back." Celine laughed humorlessly, overwhelmed by the absurdity of a waitress sitting across from a man who could erase lives. But Xavier leaned in, his eyes unwavering. "You saved that man." Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to move despite it. So, who do you want to be? The girl who pours water, or the woman who chooses the next chapter of her own life? Staring at the rain-streaked window, Celine realized she could no longer remain a bystander. She reached out and accepted the box. Inside lay a silver ring etched with the crest of a wolf and raven. "This is a symbol of protection," Xavier explained. "When you wear this, every enemy and ally understands you are under the protection of the House of Draven." Celine slid the ring onto her finger. A distinct chill swept through her body, not of fear, but of acceptance. She had chosen, and the world would respond. The shift was immediate. Leaving the bookstore, a driver in a parked car nodded in recognition. The next morning, a police officer spotted the ring and deferred to her with a touch of his cap. Later, thugs outside a nightclub froze at the glint of silver, clearing a path for her with lowered heads. She was no longer just Celine. She was untouchable, yet separated from the ordinary world by a veil of power. That evening, a message from Renata summoned her to the Sanctuary, a concrete building wrapped in ivy. Inside, Celine signed a contract written in ink that shimmered with a crimson hue, binding her to confidentiality and consequence. She surrendered her personal life, receiving a secure phone in return. "From today, you begin a 6-week training cycle," Renata stated coldly. "Only one path remains: forward." Training began before dawn under Kane, a lethal instructor who wasted no words. The first weeks were a blur of physical torture, running, climbing, and fighting until her muscles screamed. Afternoons were spent analyzing surveillance, learning to spot anomalies like a predator. Nights were for reflex training in a sensor-filled room where alarms howled at every mistake. But slowly, the panic died. Celine transformed. She stopped asking if she could survive and started asking how to be faster. By the 4th week, she moved with instinctive grace, striking weak points on mannequins before they could fully deploy. She even caught Renata sneaking up on her, noting, "You're wearing soft soles, but your collar brushes against your belt." She had learned to hear the truth and predict danger before it struck. She was no longer the waitress hiding behind a kitchen door. She was a weapon forged in the shadows. The final test was a masquerade ball at a downtown penthouse, an arena of the supernatural elite. Dressed in tailored black, Celine faced vampires and warlocks who tested her with subtle interrogations about loyalty and morality. When asked how she justified her place in their world, she didn't offer polite lies. "I think no one can keep their hands clean," she answered truthfully. "But I would choose the kind of dirty I can control." She read the room's silent code, the lies, the alliances, the hidden threats, and stood her ground without flinching. When Xavier arrived, he didn't rescue her. He acknowledged her. "You didn't just keep up," he told her later as they drove away. You made an impression. Standing on a rooftop overlooking the glowing veins of Seattle, Celine crossed her arms against the winter wind. She touched the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of her journey. She had once feared being invisible, but now she understood that a life worth remembering didn't come from safety. It came from how one stayed standing when the storm hit. She hadn't been forced into the shadows. She had walked into them. And with every step, she had learned to see the world through the eyes of someone who no longer feared the dark. Celine touched the ring on her finger. Since the day she put it on, everything had changed. Not because it offered protection, but because it symbolized choice. She hadn't been forced into this life. She had walked into it. And with every step, she learned to see the world through the eyes of someone who no longer feared its shadows. Maybe all of us have been a Celine at some point, living quietly in someone else's shadow, hoping to be seen, drifting through a life we didn't choose. But the real question is, when opportunity appears, do we dare take it? Even knowing the road ahead won't be easy, even knowing there may be no way back. Celine's story isn't just about survival. It is a question of identity. Who am I without someone else telling me where to go? Who am I when I alone choose right from wrong? Who am I in a world where trust is a luxury? And what about you? After hearing her story, have you ever felt yourself standing at a threshold the way Celine did? Have you faced a moment where you had to choose between safety and growth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would be honored to hear what resonates with you from the deepest part of your heart. Every story reflects a piece of life. And through your own voice, we might find the connection that busy days often steal from us. If this story touched something inside you, please remember to like the video, share it with someone you care about, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of the touching, meaningful stories we bring to you each day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish you good health, peaceful days, and a life filled with gentle, positive light. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.